Hi everyone. I'm very excited to talk to you today about multi-platform design systems, a topic that's near and dear to my heart. My name is Danny Banks. You can find me online at dbanksdesign. Did you know that less than 10% of public design systems support platforms other than the web? The web is the default language of design systems right now. Most of the time, when we're talking about design systems, we're talking about web design systems. And I get it. The web is an amazing platform and it's an amazing medium. Most of us have our jobs today because of the web. But it's not the only way we can reach our customers. A lot of us work on products that have applications on multiple platforms: Android, iOS, Linux, Windows, Android Watch, etc. I want to take a quick poll with the audience. How many of you work on design systems that only support the web today? I'm interested to see what that number is. So, as a community, I want us to break outside the web-centric mindset that we have and incorporate all of the platforms and ways we can connect with our customers. So let's explore some of the ways we can incorporate other platforms into our design systems. And I want to start with a disclaimer. There's no single right way to support multiple platforms in your design systems. Different products and different organizations have different needs. How many platforms you support, how many applications per platform you support, how many creators there are in your organization. And I use creators or makers because I don't want to differentiate between designers and developers or product managers. They're all part of the creation process of building experiences for customers. How centralized or decentralized your organization is, how important parity is, how differentiated experiences should be on different platforms. These are all factors for how your design systems might look. For example, this is the organization that I work in, the Amazon Seller Organization. We support 3 platforms, Android, iOS, and web. We have 1 application per platform. There's only 1 Amazon Seller app. We have thousands of creators in our organization. We're fairly decentralized. Spotify, on the other hand, might look something like this. They support 45 platforms, which is ridiculous. Salesforce might look something like this. They support tons of applications per platform. External third-party applications, internal applications. So these 3 organizations have design systems that look very different because we have very different needs for our product and for our organization. But I want to look at the commonalities across multi-platform design systems, and let's start with 2 of the fundamental goals of design systems: consistency and efficiency. And these goals take on a slightly different context and meaning when we start to think about more platforms than just the web. And I want to start with consistency, because I actually don't like the word consistency, because consistency can imply a false binary. Something is either consistent or inconsistent. But when you have a product that spans multiple platforms, it's not so cut and dry. It's not something is either consistent or inconsistent. There are many layers of consistency. So instead of consistency, I like to use cohesion, because you can use platform-specific components and conventions and still have a cohesive experience across platforms. This is sometimes called being a good platform citizen, respecting platform conventions while still having a branded application. And I say this because applications don't need to look exactly the same across all platforms. Most customers don't switch between platforms of the same device. Most of us have one phone or one computer. but customers do switch between devices. I use the Twitter web app on my laptop and the Twitter Android app on my phone. And I use the Netflix Android app on my phone and the Netflix web app on my laptop when I'm in bed watching Forensic Files. And I use the Netflix TV app on my Roku TV, which is most likely what I am using. And the consistency and experience I expect moving across these platforms depends on the product I'm using. I expect Netflix to look and function differently on these platforms because I'm using them in different ways. I expect Twitter to look more the same on these platforms because the use case is much more similar. And so this is why I use multi-platform rather than cross-platform. Cross-platform has a history and has some baggage that imply that something needs to look or function exactly the same across all platforms. But I don't think that necessarily needs to be the case in multi-platform design systems. So let's look at some of the ways that we can build cohesion across applications on different platforms. So let's say you have an iOS app, an Android app, and a web app. And right now their UIs, their front ends, are completely separated and siloed. They share a backend for their data, but their front ends are all built separately. So how can we bring these applications and these platforms together? We can start by laying solid foundations for them to all build on top of. Foundations of brand and voice and tone, content strategy, localization, communications. This is the first layer of cohesion across platforms. And one thing I want to point out real quick that can often be overlooked is cross-channel communications. So push notifications, email, SMS, lists of alerts in an application. If these things aren't consistent, it can provide a very disjointing experience to the user. If you get a push notification that appears in conflict with a list of notifications on a web app, that's not a great customer experience. So one of the ways to bring cohesion with your communications is, if you're a smaller organization, just having non-technical mechanisms like documentation, guidelines, better communication within the team works. If you're a larger organization, you'll likely need a technical solution that orchestrates and sends out messages on all of the different platforms. So these foundations create brand and voice cohesion across all of your platforms. And on top of that, we can add visual cohesion with design tokens. And people who know me or know my work would probably have expected this talk to only be about design tokens. And I get it, design tokens are my jam, but design tokens are just one part of multi-platform design systems, so I don't want to spend too much time on them here. But design tokens are very important because they provide a consistent look and feel and consistent visual design attributes in a platform agnostic way so that all platforms can have a cohesive visual experience. And we can go one level up and have cohesive definitions of components, patterns, APIs, documentation, guidelines. And these can all be shared across platforms, even if their implementation on a platform might differ. So let's look at component definitions, for example. You might have a web component called banner, and it might look like this. On Android, you could have a banner component written in Java or Kotlin, and you use it in an Android XML file, and it looks something like that. And you can also have a Swift class that looks something like this. They all share the same component definition, the same name or similar names based on language constructs, and they share the same API. They all have a variant, title, and description property. And these components can be implemented differently on different platforms and look slightly differently on different platforms, and that's okay. One great example of this is the Google Material components. They have Android, iOS, Flutter, and web packages, and their components are implemented on each of those things separately. So if you're building an iOS app, you work with the iOS material components as you would any other iOS code. And one thing I want to point out here is that not all components need to be shared across all platforms. Some components make sense on some platforms and not on others. But those differences should be intentional rather than unintentional. Unintentional divergence can lead to a lot of frustration. If you have an alert component on the web and a banner component on mobile, and the alert component has a variant property that can be set to danger, and the banner component has an alert level that can be set to error. Functionally and semantically, these things actually mean the same thing. They're the same component. But because they were built differently, it's very confusing to creators building with those components. I wish this were a hypothetical example, but it's not. This is an example of components currently in our web and mobile design systems right now. We are working to unify our component definitions, and what would have helped our organization is if this article by the Lyft Design Systems team came out a few years earlier. They talk about how they design and build components in parallel so that any discussions or platform differences get addressed and implemented together. My organization went through a lot of pain when we defined and built a component for one platform and not the other, and then had to port it to the other one. Oftentimes, either the naming or how the component works was built in a platform-centric way, and it was hard to port to the other platform. One of the ways our team is working to address this is for each component writing the documentation and sample code first before any code is actually written. This allows us to fully think through the problem of the component across all platforms and really think through the ergonomics of using that component. And you might be thinking to yourself right now, why not just use one implementation of a component? Why should you implement a component 3 times for 3 different platforms? You could use web technology, HTML and CSS, and wrap it in a native application using something like Cordova or Electron. And you have one implementation of a component across all platforms. Or you could use something like React Native or Flutter. These all make sense to some organizations, but not to others. Because again, there's not one single way to support multiple platforms for all organizations. But really the system should support how creators work. If you recall the radar chart I showed earlier, depending on how many applications per platform you support, how important differentiation is, a platform may or may not make sense. The Salesforce Lightning design systems have design token libraries for Android, iOS, and web because they need to support many different applications, many different mobile applications. If they chose a specific framework like React Native or Flutter, then they would be forcing that technical decision on every other application that wants to use the Salesforce Lightning design systems. And so it really depends on your organization. My organization decided the best thing for our customers was to have differentiated mobile and web experiences, but we also didn't want the creators in our organization to have to worry about the differences between Android and iOS. So we built our systems to support this way of working. So now we're starting to talk about how creators build experiences across platforms. And I want to say that creating experiences across platforms is difficult, even if you do use a framework. Imagine You're working on a product that has Android, iOS, and web applications, and you wanted to add a feature to all of them. How would you go about doing that? Do you need to design multiple sets of mockups, get design approval from multiple teams, implement those changes in different languages and code bases, test them on different devices or simulators? The effort to deliver an experience could be more than tripled because now you're working in different environments and context switching and having to understand different ways of working. So we need to remove that friction and remove those barriers in between platforms so that our creators are more efficient. So now let's talk about efficiency. Efficiency can lack humanity. We don't want creators to mindlessly churn out features as fast as possible. And so I actually don't like the word efficiency either. Instead of thinking purely about efficiency, I think about autonomy. How can the systems make creating experiences more accessible to anyone so that creators have the autonomy and agency to build experiences for all platforms? And we can do this by removing the friction and barriers of designing and building for multiple platforms and devices. One barrier of application development is setting up the development environment. You usually need to pull down the entire application code base, install dependencies and libraries and tools, find some random error message, Google it, copy and paste something from Stack Overflow, find a new error message, maybe lay down and cry for a little bit, come back, fix it, finally compile and build the application, and now you're ready to start coding. Now you need to figure out where to write that code in that application code base. And you might need to do this multiple times. That is terrible. So instead, we should be looking to build low friction environments for creators to work in where they don't need to pull in the full application code base or don't need to use native tools or install libraries or dependencies. One of the ways that our team is reducing that friction is we set up an environment that allows people to download a debug version of our application just from a website, drag that application onto a simulator, and then run a single command, and they can start building interfaces in that application in minutes rather than a full day of setup. And it's running native code, no web views, no extra runtimes like React Native or Flutter, but that is a topic for another talk. This development environment has allowed us to rely less on mockups and prototypes so that we can reduce the entire product creation lifecycle from weeks to days. We encourage people to use the lowest fidelity possible to express their intent, especially as they're building features for multiple platforms. We don't want people having mockups for each platform because that can be very tedious. So instead, we want to use the lowest fidelity possible so that we can get to code quicker and actually build the experience in the way that the customer would ultimately see. And one of the ways we do that also is with designer and developer pairing. I'll sit in a conference room with a designer and I'll start up the development environment that I showed earlier, and we'll start building an interface and seeing the changes and iterating. And after a few hours, we have production-ready UI code fully built, and we don't need to spend days or weeks working on mockups, sending those mockups to developers to implement, and going back and forth. We can just see exactly what the customers would ultimately see, and we can reduce many steps in that production creation lifecycle. We still have a ways to go. This is still not accessible to non-technical people. It's still a development environment. And so our plan is to work on making that more accessible to non-technical people, being able to build interfaces without having to write code, but still be production code and production ready. And these advances have allowed us to distribute creation across our organization and spread the ownership throughout our organization. We want people to own the experience across all platforms, rather than having teams siloed by platform. And to do this, we needed to meet creators where they were. Our organization has lots of different types of teams. Some it's just a product manager and a developer, some have full design teams, some have full development teams, but they all need to build experiences across platforms. And so we needed to be able to support each of these different ways of working, and we did that by lowering the barriers between platforms and reducing friction. Because we want to allow anyone to create and own experiences and features across all platforms. And really what we needed to do is we needed to meet people where they are. We need to meet customers where they are on different platforms and different devices, giving them a cohesive experience as they move across devices. And we need to meet creators where they are, building experiences for those customers and for those platforms. So rather than thinking about a feature for a single platform at a time, working backwards from the customer, agnostic of the platform, and building for all platforms at the same time. Really, we're trying to empower people by creating cohesive experiences across platforms, by cultivating cohesion and autonomy rather than consistency and efficiency. Everyone in your organization should feel empowered to build cohesive experiences for customers across all platforms. By next year's Clarity, I want to see over 25% of public design systems support multiple platforms. This topic is still very new, and there's a lot of stuff that I didn't have time to cover in this talk, like comparing multi-platform frameworks like Flutter and React Native and Xamarin, layout and component composition, flat versus nested component structures, and how those are affected when you start building from multiple platforms. Other platforms like digital assistants and TV and watch, accessibility in native applications, how to document native components. I saw a demo recently from the folks at Intuit that displayed native components in Storybook and were actually being rendered natively, not just an image. And it's things like that that really excite me, and I'm really excited to see more innovations like these and see how other organizations incorporate platforms into their design systems. Thank you all for listening, and a huge thank you to Gina and this amazing conference. I love talking about this stuff. If you would like to talk more about multi-platform design systems, please reach out to me on the Design Systems Slack or on Twitter, and I would love to talk to you. Thank you so much for listening.
So many things there to talk about. That was such an awesome talk. Thank you so much for that. How are you doing today?
Doing all right. How about yourself?
Awesome, doing great. I'm going to just dive right into the questions here.
Let's
go. First one is, why can't you trust an atom?
I don't know.
It's because they make up everything.
That was a good one. I like that.
Let's start from the top here. One of the most common questions that I hear, I bet you hear this all the time, is, and you mentioned this a bit in your talk, about not everything has to look the same across platforms. And one of the things related to that, one of the things that always kind of comes into this is, what about brand, right? So if we have a brand typeface, do we use our brand typeface on our iOS app, or do we use the stuff that's built into the device? How do you think about stuff like that? Like, where does brand come into play? Where does what is actually native to a particular device or context or a customer context in there? Like, how do you kind of sort some of that stuff out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really think, it kind of depends on the brand and the product. Some brands and products are very tightly integrated with a very defined brand. And for them, the typeface is very important, and I would say definitely use the typeface in Android, iOS native applications. For others, maybe it's just not as important, like something like Snapchat, for example. They're a very like visual, very branded application, and I could see them using like a custom branded font in their applications. So it really depends on like the type of application, type of brand you are. Um, but like it could go either way depending.
Yeah, got it. You brought up a lot of different things about sequencing in your talk. And so, one of the interesting things that you talked about was like building platforms in parallel. And it reminded me a little bit of when Work and Co. a bunch of years ago did the Virgin America redesign. Rest in peace, that redesign was awesome. And they talked about like, well, did you do it like mobile first or desktop first? And they were like, we just kind of built all of them at the same time. We kind of worked on all of them and worked on all the pieces. Do you see a lot of parallels between the way that you design and develop for responsive experiences and the way that you would design and build for multiple platform experiences, or do you find that those are pretty different processes?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're very similar, and kind of what I try to push teams towards is not like mobile first or desktop first, but customer first. So there are certain features or experiences that you might want to implement part of it on mobile, part of it on web. You might need to have it all responsive. There's no single like we do all devices at once. We do mobile first. It really starts with the customer problem. And like the application that I work on, we have very different needs for like our mobile app versus our web app. And we have a lot of like native mobile experience, like scanning labels with the phone that obviously we don't have on web. And so it really starts with the customer problem. And it could be, starting with all platforms, all device sizes at the same time.
That makes a lot of sense. And that kind of ties into why you would recommend, I mentioned, that like you don't have to have parity across all the platforms because the customer need might be different from platform to platform.
Yep, exactly.
Martin has a question in the chat. Maybe you can kind of take us through an example. So he's got kind of a use case question. So he said, maybe you can walk us through this example. I need to choose a date in Android, which has a good date picker, versus iOS, which has not so great of a date picker, versus web, which is probably a custom component. How do you think about designing or creating those kinds of different elements to go in one design system?
Yep, that's a great question. Generally, what we try to do is, first do a bit of like tech research of, like what's available on each of the platforms, how, user friendly is it? Like, do we want to actually use it? But also looking at like the ergonomics of the component from like a developer's perspective, like what does the component API look like? What are the options that it has? And something like a date picker, that's a great example. Generally, like we try to default to what the platform has. The iOS date picker is not great, but it's kind of a cost thing, right? Like, is it worth it to develop a custom iOS date picker? For most of the time, probably not. But maybe again, like if you have a very branded experience and you want a very custom date picker, that might actually be cost effective for you to build. But a lot of times, it's probably most cost effective to spend your time somewhere else. I think it was you talked about something in a podcast about sauce, right? Like how much sauce do you want to like put? Like you can't have a meal of only sauce, and so it's like where do you want to put that sauce, right? Like do you really want to put it on a date picker or do you want to put it somewhere else?
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Just a quick nuance here. Peter was talking about this in the chat during your talk too. When you talk about platform, what do you really mean by that? Like, is native app a platform, or is like iOS a platform, or like is a fridge a platform, or is Frigidaire or LG a platform, or how about like car? Is that a platform, or like CarPlay? So maybe you could talk a little bit about what you mean by platform in that sense.
That's a great question. I actually had some slides in the talk where I'd kind of get into like what's a platform versus a device versus an SDK, and it just kind of it got a little too confusing. But a platform is how you reach a customer. So iOS, right? Android, web, Windows, Mac, Linux. So those are platforms. That's how you release your application to customers. Versus like a device or device type like mobile versus desktop. And you could be mobile web or mobile iOS. So like the application could be kind of at a crossroads of device and platform. And generally, we do kind of sometimes make the distinction of like we're designing for mobile here. We're not designing for Android and iOS because we want the mobile experience to be a certain way versus the web experience. But sometimes we do speak about like we want the iOS experience to be this way, the Android experience to be that way.
Those are super handy definitions. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Owen asks, do you have any advice on creating centralized documentation for multi-platform design systems? To your point, a lot of the design systems that we see out there are mostly for web or primarily for web. And then, the iOS or Android kind of feels like a tucked in, like it's tucked in somewhere or kind of shoehorned somewhere. Do you have any advice on how to create the centralized documentation for all the different teams that work on those different platforms?
Yeah, definitely. One way is, if you have the actual separate code bases, relying on documentation generation of those languages. Android and iOS, they have, documentation generators, so you can hook into those and feed those into your centralized documentation site. Also for kind of like sharing component definitions, you could, define those in like a YAML based file that are then consumed and used in Android, iOS, web. And then that's kind of where your documentation lives. So like they're all working off of the same component definition and documentation. And they're actually implemented on each different platform. So there's like really a number of ways that you could do it kind of depending on your technology setup. But it is really important to co-locate your documentation like on a documentation site. So, your button component has Android, iOS, and web code. And maybe right now they have different APIs. So it's important to have those on the documentation site. So you don't have to go to like, oh, I need to get the mobile documentation site because I'm designing for mobile now, or the web one.
Nice. Okay, there's a follow-up question on that one too from Liz. So Liz asked, how do you reconcile iOS, Android, and necessary custom components iframed in as web views? Right, so that adds a kind of a different layer to that. Do you treat those any differently?
In terms of like documentation,
let's go with that.
Yeah, like I don't treat those any differently. Like, a component is a component, and even like components that like might be named differently, like we have an alert component for web and a banner component for mobile, but those are the same thing, right? And so we have that component documentation at the same place, regardless of what the actual implementation of it is on a specific platform. If it's a web view, if it's an iOS component, an Android component, even if you're using like, say, a built-in like a platform Android component, still having that documentation on like, the date picker documentation, just so that you don't need to go to separate places and like, hey, go to the Android documentation to figure out how to use this component, right?
Yep, got it. Lots of questions pouring into the chat, so I'm just going to keep firing through them if that's all right.
Yep.
All right, so Diana asked, how have you prioritized the work when onboarding new platforms to bring them in sync? So for example, we started with CSS, then we added React, and then components in Rails. So how do you kind of onboard new ones and then keep them in sequence?
That is a very good question. We actually started with our mobile components first and then built our web separately. And that's actually more of like an organizational thing with us. We had kind of separate teams, and we're actually working this year and next year to kind of merge the teams together. And from now, start with all platforms at once and building, components. So I'd really say it really depends on, the needs and kind of priority of how important is it for, your applications right now to sort of exist within the design systems, and like, how are people working today? And is it, very difficult for people to kind of build for all platforms at once? And so kind of prioritizing where those like friction points are, and getting that kind of much more smooth so that people can actually build across platforms at the same time.
Got it. That's a good segue. So let's move now to kind of our last segment here of this Q&A. Let's talk about all the people stuff related to this. So
Yep.
A great question from Allard in the chat. What advice do you have around changing an organization with siloed teams per platform to the building for all platforms at once? So how do you make that happen culturally?
Yeah, it's very tough, I will say. It's actually, we have found it easier if you start with like your mostly web and then you start to add like Android and iOS afterwards, because generally your teams by that point have kind of, for lack of a better word, congealed around certain features or certain types of experiences. So like we have like an orders team and a returns team and a listings team. And so what we try to do is like teams or organizations should own a feature across all platforms. And so you have kind of like platform teams, which are like the design systems teams, and then like the feature teams. So they kind of like overlap at like intersecting points. And so that's kind of generally how we organize the teams and organize the structure.
Nice. That's a good visual to kind of like get a cross section of all of those things. That's cool.
Yeah.
One of the things that I loved about your talk is you talked about less mock-ups, lower fidelity, getting to code quicker, designer and developer pairing. When I teach teams to collaborate better, just in general on web stuff, those are the same exact things that we do. We talk about, and we teach that for web. And one of the things that comes up when we talk about doing that for web, like sitting together, designers and developers, and like prototyping together, and really working on the same thing together rather than waterfall. One of the things that comes up, especially around mobile specifically, and iOS and Android, is compile time. Because compile time it adds a little bit of friction to what normally in a web process, you save and refresh, or your build tools are already automatically refreshing and you can see the results. Yep. With when you're building for native devices, you have to compile some of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Do you find that brings a lot of friction to the collaboration process, or have you found some ways around that?
It does add a lot of friction, and there are some ways around it. So what our team has kind of built is, we don't want teams to have to write Android and iOS code to build a feature for those apps. So we have kind of a cloud-driven native UI architecture. So teams build like a web endpoint that serves JSON that describes like, I want a banner component with this information and this component with this information. And then we take that and actually turn it into native components on each app. So in the video I showed in the presentation, you could just download a debug version of our app and fire up like a local server and start making changes and seeing that reflected in the app without having to recompile the app every time. Apart from that, like Swift UI is really great on iOS for not needing compiles anymore to have they have previews. And Android also has had kind of not necessarily hot reloading, but if you're just changing like an XML file, you should be able to reload the current view in the app without having to recompile. So there are ways around that, kind of depending on how you architect your application.
I mean, it sounds like those are starting to come into the languages itself. Until that fully happens, do you think it's worth it for teams to invest in building those kinds of tools on their own? Do you think the lift is too high for the return on investment, or do you think it's worthwhile if they're doing a lot of specific native lift?
I think it's worthwhile depending on the size and scale of your team. It made sense for our team. We have dozens of teams, thousands of developers building features in our application, and we just don't want thousands of people having to compile the app every time they build a feature. Maybe if you're a smaller team, you just have a handful of developers, it's probably a little bit too much, too much cost to take on right now. So it really kind of depends on your size and your needs. And also we needed a very decentralized way to kind of build interfaces, because having 1,000 people contribute code into one thing that gets then compiled and released is a nightmare.
Right. Yeah, got it. All right, last question for you. It's come from the chat kind of on that topic of low fidelity and all that. Chat asks, how do you get buy-in for the lowest possible fidelity mockups from PMs who are used to or addicted to high fidelity mockups?
That's a good question. I'm actually dealing with that with the project right now. It's, I think it really gets down to showing them the value, being able to show them, hey, this is a prototype and it's actually running production code. You can download this app and actually see it on your phone, and not have to just, get a sketch file and see what it specifically looks like. So it's really kind of breaking that first barrier and getting them to see for the first time, hey, this is what we're actually building and this is how much quicker it was to build, rather than going through the normal waterfall process of, requirements to mockups to development. So it's really doing that like first kind of like example with them.
That's awesome. I also love how you strategically had your cat enter the frame there and just kind of hang out behind you. This is excellent.
Yeah, my partner actually opened the door and like shoved the cat into the room a couple minutes ago.
It was perfect. It was right on cue too. Last thing, this is less of a question than just like a cool thing that you did. Camera thrown down. You said by next year you want to see 25% of public design systems support multiple platforms. I love that. That's the challenge to all of you that are listening. Danny, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. So many great questions and so many great topics that you brought up. Thank you so much for that.
Awesome. Thank you.